ask everyone first to please come down and take their seats. So my name is Callum Nicholson. I'm Director of Research here at the Danube Institute. And here in Hungary right now, we're very lucky to have a number of really interesting visiting fellows, not just at the Danube Institute, but also MCC. And we've currently got two very interesting guys in town at the moment. And I was speaking to them a few weeks ago, and I said it'd be a really good idea if we could get them here to talk about their ideas and even to talk between each other. And they're actually, they collaborate on a lot of stuff. And two speakers are Travis Brown. Travis is an independent filmmaker, and he also works with Peter Boghossian, who's a philosopher and public intellectual. If you Google him, you'll find channels with hundreds of thousands of followers, and he's someone who's really provoking conversations in an era when people are not conversing enough, I think, across the spectrum. So that's enough for me, really. What we're going to do is start with a trailer for the films, Travis's films, and then Travis will introduce, they'll both come down here, Travis will introduce his general project. Two of these short films will be shown, and then we'll have a discussion about it. So first of all, can we have the trailer, please? Thank you.
I don't care how white passing I am mixed and I'm fucking brown! You're no better than me, I wish you would, white lady, I wish you would.
Unfortunately, a large number of people, believing they're acting in the name of justice, seem to think that you can play groups of people against other groups in order to win. This isn't a solution for justice, it's a solution for endless ongoing division.
It's not just that it's just spontaneously or arbitrarily pops up. There's a system in place that manufactures these ideas. They look at the universities as their own particular ideology mill, and they indoctrinate people into intersectionality. So a whole generation of people are now believing things that are totally untethered to reality. These are people who are teaching very dangerous ideas. What makes those ideas dangerous is that they're divisive. We start looking at each other in terms of race. This does not advance civil rights causes. It's exactly the opposite.
I have actually been fired. I've been replaced for not towing the line. If you show up as an authentic individual in any way, shape, or form where the woke ideology holds sway, well, we will take away your ability to support yourself, we'll take away your ability to eat, we'll take away your ability to own anything. It's deeply dystopian.
It's lazy to just like set somebody off and say, I don't care about their life anymore and I don't want this person to have any way back ever. If that's the modus operandi you're going to live by, you better be careful, because absolutely this will come for you.
And this is being driven by people who believe they are doing this and acting in this way in order to make us all freer. And they're not. They're tying everyone down. They're tying us up. They're holding everybody back.
Okay, so that's the trailer for the series. Now, if I could ask Travis to come down and just introduce the two films we're going to show back to back now before we have the discussion. Thanks, Travis.
Well, first of all, thanks to Callum and to Pete for connecting me to Callum and to Melissa. And it's an honor to be able to show this here today. I was largely inspired to make this series because I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian home that was very, very dogmatic and very controlling. And eventually I lost my faith, and I moved out of the home and ended up in Portland, Oregon. And if you know anything about Portland, it's basically the woke capital of the world, or at least one of them. And so when everyone was kind of going insane in 2020, after COVID, after George Floyd died, I saw all these people acting in what I saw is a very fundamentalist religious way, really in a more of a cult-like way. People were saying anyone who's a Republican is a bigot, or anyone who voted for Trump is a white supremacist. And this, I consider myself on the left to some degree at the time, and that struck me as really strange. No one was able to just have conversations where they disagreed about these topics in Portland. And Portland was the scene of, I think it was about 150 days straight of rioting after George Floyd died. So it just struck me that something pretty bizarre and unique was going on, not just in Portland, but all over the world, especially in the United States. And I started thinking about it in terms of something like a religious reformation, but it's more like an organic, unorganized religious reformation. And Niall Ferguson, a historian that I interviewed for the series, he brought this up. He said, when organized religion starts to decline, unorganized religion comes in and takes its place. And so that was kind of the structure for the series. And I was lucky enough to meet quite a few interesting people and interview some of my heroes, like Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Peter is in the series as well. And then I put a little bit of my own story in there because I thought it was interesting. And so what we'll see tonight is just the first episode, which sort of introduces where woke ideology comes from and why it's proliferated. And then we'll watch episode 10, which is really where the meat is, I think. And this is something that Callum and I talked about, which is why do people become attracted to these ideologies in the first place? And personally, I think it's largely a lack of meaning and a lack of structure in their lives. And so that's really the intro I wanted to give for it. So we can talk a little bit after and see if we can find anything interesting to disagree about. So, yeah.
Thanks, Travis. So if we could just play the two films now back to back, I think. Thank you, Gussie. Thanks very much, Travis, for that. Peter, could I ask you to come down and join us, and we'll start a discussion. Of course, yeah, wherever you want to sit. Where do you want to sit? Okay. All right, there you go. Okay, well, thanks, guys, for both being here, and thanks, Travis, for the films. And I didn't have any prepared questions because I wanted to see what came out of the films as we're watching them tonight. And it's really interesting, that second one, how you framed it around your own story of pain. And I was starting to think, I think you're using it as a sort of an analogy for society in general. I wonder, I was going to ask, why do you think all of this woke stuff has emerged? But that could be quite a sociological, analytical question. The question I have is really, why the pain, in a sense that clearly it seems with people who turn to strong ideologies, often I think there's a very clear sense a lot of people are in pain. I'll give an example, like it's quite clear to me a lot of people who turn to these social justice ideas, if you look at them, they're often people living in, take your average person who believes in this stuff, they're 24, living in a city like New York or Portland, they can't afford their rent, they can't find a stable job, they've got massive student debt they'll never pay off. Even if they find a job, it's not well paid. And so what can they say? They can say, well, I have nothing, but I have my virtue. Like a Franciscan monk, in bare feet, but they're virtuous. But I kind of feel that if you look at an entire generation, it's very difficult to imagine, if you grew up in the suburbs in a nice sort of family supportive environment, nice community and school, parents who are employed and so on, it's very difficult for many people to imagine, if you're 25, ever achieving the things their parents had. And I imagine there's a sense of shame in that, a sense of pain, in a sense of alienation from society. So I suppose my opening question for you, and I have a lot of questions for both of you actually, but out of that. But the first one is there a pain behind all of this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think I didn't use the word pain to describe the social ills in the film, but that is essentially what I think comes from having a lack of meaning and a lack of structure and purpose to one's life. I mean, I think people are naturally in some kind of psychological pain. There's the economic pain that you mentioned as well, but I think there've always been various types of economic or there was. People lived through 2 world wars. There have always been really massive problems. Steven Pinker has written a lot about this and just how much we've improved as a society and all of the great things that we've gained through technology and through various types of progress. But yeah, I definitely think there's a certain kind of pain underlying why people gravitate to these ideologies, because they provide a way to make sense of that pain and a way to give it purpose, I think. Many people may disagree with me on this, but what's interesting is I grew up being constantly told that if I didn't believe in Jesus as my savior, that my life would be empty, and I'd be full of pain, I'd be depressed. And actually, interestingly enough, it was really kind of the reverse of that for me, that I felt more empty trying to believe this stuff that I couldn't really fully believe. I believed it for a while, but eventually, as I mentioned, I lost my faith. But for me, kind of reclaiming my own intellectual life and abandoning the beliefs actually was very, very fulfilling for me, and allowed me, even though I went through a period of psychological pain and depression, once I got out of that, I haven't felt that empty or that depressed or that miserable since then. And it's challenging. And so I don't think that everyone's going to just naturally do that. I think, people have, as you say, bills to pay, families to raise, they just want to live life. So these things are really challenging. I mean, that's why we have someone like Viktor Frankl writing about, meaning, who survived being interned in, the Holocaust camps. So, as far as the question of what to do about it, that's a much more difficult question, I think.
Yeah, Peter. I mean, I suppose. I mean, you were talking about just now. In your answer, you were talking about there've been many traumas societies suffered, the world wars, and so on. What is unique about this particular era now? Why are we seeing all this stuff everywhere?
That's a great question. I think it's a kind of cultural myopia to think that we are somehow unique in discharging these. There's really no other way to say it. There's no politic way to say it. These deranged urges of which the society is overcome by multiple simultaneous mass delusions. But, I was thinking about Travis's answer, and I think that's absolutely right. We've been through wars, famines, pandemics, but the way that people, I think it was Nietzsche who said, the most satisfying thing for a slave is to discharge the will to power on another slave. So I think that the way that manifests itself differs from age to age. But it is myopic to think that somehow the derangement that we're in now is worse than the derangement of throwing Jews in ovens or enslaving people. Or these are just different features of the human condition. And I don't mean to say that in a depressive note. I think that there are ways to overcome those, but I don't think there's anything unique about this particular ill.
I just want to pull back for a second, because there's something, obviously, I imagine how you first met. You're both from Portland. You taught at the University of Portland.
Portland State University, and you grew up or lived in Portland. I think you were living in Portland.
Yeah, for about 17 years or so.
Yeah, and so I remember in 2020 when we were all trapped at home and everyone joined Twitter. And I remember I joined Twitter, and everything was just these incredible scenes out of Portland. Could you just talk about that? About just tell us a story of being in Portland in 2020. How did it all emerge? Did it just emerge overnight? And explain to people what actually happened. Not everyone here may be aware of it, but just talk about Portland in that era and the significance of it, and to what extent is this still?
So we're laughing. I mean, the reason that we're laughing is it's just like so crazy. We could describe it, and people say, "Oh, these guys are exaggerating," or "It's not true." So I usually don't talk about it, because it's just, if it were a little less crazy, it would be more believable. But I'll give you
Well, I would just back up a little bit and say that I saw a start to some of this really as early as, 2014, 2015, especially when Trump was nominated. I mean, there was Antifa in the street back then, and people were rioting actually when he won the election the first time, and things were on fire back then. The riots weren't as consecutive and as long-lasting as they were in 2020, but you could see that back then, and I should have traced my history a little bit further back, saying that I did see that same kind of attitude. It was just a little bit less pronounced. This attitude of like, if you don't agree with us, if you're not a Democrat, a far left-leaning Democrat, you're basically a Nazi. I mean, and then as Peter and some of our friends know very well, it manifested not only in the streets, but obviously in academia, in interpersonal relationships, on social media, especially in 2020. But yeah, there are so many stories.
And you lost friends. We both lost friends.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What does that mean, lost friends?
People we loved and cared about, people who had been in our home to eat, people who we hung out with socially.
But in the sense that they suddenly disagreed with you so firmly that they ostracized you.
Well, here's a good example. There's a guy in the film when I'm talking where I'm leaning back in the seat of a car. My friend Matt, really genuinely good person, very intelligent. He was helping me make a film about Peter's first book. This was the first documentary that I was making. It's still not complete yet because I keep making other films. But it's all about how to have impossible conversations. And so we were making a proof of concept for it. We filmed a lot of our own conversations because he and I disagreed on quite a few things. We interviewed Peter back in, it was 2019, I think. And then I got kind of derailed to make the Woke Reformation, and Pete and I went on Dave Rubin's show with Douglas Murray and had a conversation about this, and Matt calls me up and says, I no longer want to be a part of your film. And I was like, oh, really? Why? What happened? And he didn't really want to talk about it, and I actually invited him. I said, for the sake of the film, it'd be really interesting if you and I could talk about this on camera. We could see what our disagreements were. No, nothing. I mean, he basically very interestingly said that going on Dave Rubin's show with Pete and Douglas was not a good way for me to get my story out, which was kind of ironic. But so I don't know. I don't really know. I think he didn't like what we had to say, and he just wasn't willing to talk about it.
Yeah, I want to amend my last answer and add something to it. There is something, unique might be too strong of a word, but not to be pedantic, but unique can't be modified. But there is something about this ideology now and those who are in the orbit of the ideology, which is almost unique to, in the film, what Helen calls applied postmodernism. And that is that these discourses, these structures of power, these conversations that people have with other people, embedded within those conversations and discourses is a way to cement and calcify the power hierarchies. And so the problem that we see in the last 15 years or so, and it's very pronounced and conspicuous when you move in the public space, is that people with whom you have substantive disagreements about issues that have identity level salience won't have conversations with you. They absolutely refuse to speak to you. That is a necessary constitutive part of the ideology. So these are not leftists. These are not, Noam Chomsky economic leftists. This is a new type of applied postmodernism. And within this ideology, you do not have conversations with someone for fear of ideological contamination, moral contamination. It's a signal, it's an in-group signal to your tribe that if you go out-group, you're a bad person. So this makes those problems incredibly difficult to solve, especially when the people who are, hold power in the institutions, they are the main people, like they have the power, so why would they want to have the conversation? Doesn't make any sense for them.
Can I give you a quick story? Because you asked about just stories of what happened in Portland. So in Seattle, there was as we were talking about earlier, the Chaz, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, where for I think it was
the autonomous zone of Chaz, depending on the Monty Python.
Right, exactly. And so basically, some thugs took over part of Capitol Hill, and it was a pretty big part of Capitol Hill. Ended up with a couple of teenagers dying, or at least one teenager dying, and then another, I think, being shot. So it was just this lawless, anarchic zone that apparently was a utopia for them. And then something similar happened in Portland. It didn't get as much press, and it was smaller. It was only like a 2-block radius or something. But it happened to be where I used to live previously. I lived right in the area. It was on Skidmore and Albina in Portland, and it was called the Red House Autonomous Zone. And what happened was Antifa set up this completely messy barricade around this red house that happened to house, I think one of the woman was Native American and the guy was black, And any article you'd read about it, it said, BIPOC people live in this house, which means black, indigenous, people of color or something. And so it turns out that Antifa decided that they didn't want these people to be evicted because the police were going to evict them in, I think it was December of 2020. And so they surrounded it. They had a lot of weapons. I went there for myself and filmed. I put some of the footage in there, but they had weapons, in their holsters. I know a lot of people that went there and scoped it out. We got chased several times. It was totally insane. But if you do just a tiny bit of digging beyond the pieces, and like the Mercury or these local Portland papers, if you did just a tiny bit of digging, you could find that the people who were being evicted purposefully didn't pay their mortgage for 2 years, or over 2 years, I think it was. And they had a criminal record, and I actually saw police reports that they were saying, the police were saying to each other, never go to this house without backup. These people are armed. There were all these complaints about the woman like beating puppies over the head to death, like just totally insane shit. And yet they raised, I think, like $200,000 or $300,000 for them to stay in their house. And they also had another house a few blocks away.
Yeah, and that's the part of this. It's just so crazy that when you tell people this, they're like, "That's just too crazy." Like that's just too that could not possibly.
As a matter of fact, I had a picture. I think it was from Andy No, our mutual friend, with one of the guys with a machine gun and a radio in his ear, and I sent it to my friend or ex-friend, I guess, Matt, the one who was making the film with me, and he just didn't believe the photo. He's like, "Well, who took that photo?" Yeah, he just didn't believe me. So what do you do?
What is it about Portland? Is it in the water? Is it the weed? I'm not sure. Really, it's a serious question. Why? Because Portland's it's always had this association with, well, in the past, I think the WTO protests started there in 1999, right? And that was...
I thought it was Seattle.
Well, Seattle. Yeah. I get the two confused. Okay, so it's close. But why Portland? What were the conditions there that led that community to be ripe for this?
I think it's a combination of things. Cushing and Dunning call it the big sort, where people go to different neighborhoods. I was just telling someone on the show that I had the other day, I had to move out of, I was literally physically chased out of the city of Portland, like literally physically with my life, I had to leave the city of Portland. And I was just telling someone, I simply could not believe that I was able to sell my house. It utterly blew my mind that anybody would want to live in Portland. People are just openly defecating on the streets. Like, tent camping was rampant. I'm not talking about smoking pot, like heroin needles. It was so. And I used to post photos on Twitter of like massive tent camps, and invariably people would say, "That's photoshopped. That's not Portland." And I couldn't say to anybody, "Hey, that's 1 block from my house. What are you talking about?" Because I didn't want them to know where I live. But so why Portland? I think it's a combination of things. I think the big sort is a part of it. I think that my former institution was it was an actual social justice factory. It was a factory for forwarding certain conclusions about the world, conclusions that racism is the ordinary and everyday state of affairs, conclusions that every disparity in outcome is due to systems, that we're in a patriarchy, that we have to disable heteronormativity, and yada, yada, on and on. The claims are... In denial of that is a manifestation of your white fragility, from Robin DiAngelo. And so I think you had the main engine of knowledge production had, as Jonathan Haidt said, the New York NYU social psychologist, it had lost its telos and it had a new purpose. The end was to promote and forward social justice. So you're creating little foot soldiers, little henchmen in service to the ideology. And then you had Antifa on top of it all.
Just explain, for anyone who's not familiar, Antifa, just explain that for a second.
Well, they're the anti-fascist. They've become what they hate. They're the anti-fascist. And Andy No had a #1 selling best book on this, our friend. They're the #1, they're the anti-fascists who believe that you have to, they're kind of the militant arm of left-wing ideology.
Are they acephalous, like headless, or are they an organized group?
No, they're cell-less and divisionless, and there's actually...
But there are leaders. Andy has talked about that, and you can tell once you do a little bit of digging. They claim that it's leaderless and it's anarchistic, but there are people who... Rose City Antifa actually posted stickers. I took a bunch of pictures of their stickers with emails and phone numbers, and they just don't want people to think that they have leaders, because then it makes it easier for them to organize and do things. And I touched on it a little bit in terms of why I think Portland went down that path, but there's a history to Portland that it actually used to be fairly racist. I think in like the 80s, or there were skinhead gangs, and so I think partly they're trying to atone for that, and partly they did push for gay marriage and all these other things, and then so they see this new, what they think is an injustice, and so then they just kind of glom onto that. And it's the same with the trans stuff. Most people in Portland, which I'm making another series about, which has been the most depressing film I've ever made before, but they think, oh well, there's this racial injustice, we must fight against it, or kids can be trans, therefore they think it's just like being gay. They think it's the same thing, and so they don't actually critically think for a few minutes about how actually maybe this is a little bit different.
Yeah, and to piggyback off of that, my speculation as to why that is that, to borrow Martin Luther King's phrase, the moral arc bends towards justice, and so people see these things as an extension of the civil rights movement, and so that they see that, well, gay rights, we've given rights to gays, we've given rights to minorities, we've given rights to animals. The next stage in that is the trans issue. There are all these, we need to extend that umbrella of rights to cover more people, and this is a phrase you'll frequently hear, I'm on the right side of history. This is the right side of history.
Just as an aside, it's interesting that a lot of this preoccupation in the Anglosphere with pronouns doesn't really apply in Hungary because it's a gender-neutral language. And so my joke is the only trans issue that matters in Hungary is Transylvania. So it's so I had a question for you. So at the same time as everyone on one side were talking about social justice stuff, the other side were talking about QAnon. And for those who don't know, QAnon was basically an online, well, basically it seemed to be like a online forum where someone took all the conspiracies out there, who shot JFK, the lizard people, the moon landing was faked, and they conglomerated them together into one massive conspiracy. Now, the reason I raise it is that I don't think many reasonable people deny that QAnon was a massive conspiracy theory. But and as with all conspiracy theories, little elements of facts that have been put together, like you look at a cloud and you see the face of Mother Teresa. It was that sort of way of thinking, And it's, but I'm wondering with the social justice protests, for me, it's patterned in a very similar way because they've taken all of these different grievances and patterned them together into a grand theory, which ultimately reduces down to something like white supremacy. So I wonder, is that framing of the social justice activists essentially a conspiracy theory?
Okay, so two things. I don't think that those are analogous, QAnon to critical social justice. And the reason is the organs of power are in the United States, at least in Western Europe, and in the Anglosphere, I'd extend that. The organs of power belong and are dominated. The media landscape is dominated by the people who participate in the ideology. QAnon had no organs of power. They had no instruments of power. And they had no way...
Well, they had Trump, to be fair. I mean, there are a lot of people...
Okay, there's a... So we're literally talking... I'm talking about the engines of knowledge production are controlled. Journals are controlled. The ideology had woven its way into media, into Hollywood. So I don't think that those are analogous. And even Trump, there wasn't he didn't put in a secretary of QAnon. So that the institutionalization, there was no institutionalization. Okay, that's the first point. And then the second point was, say that part again, the second piece of your question.
And they put me on the spot. The second point was, they seem to be patterned similarly to me, and everyone accused one of being a conspiracy theory. And I'm wondering, is this accusation, is there anything in the social justice position that the world is a white supremacy empire and conspiracy?
Do you want to take that, or do you want me to take it?
I think there's nothing at all to it. I think if you go back many decades in the U.S. and currently now in certain parts of the world, you can see a certain kind of what you might consider systemic bias or systemic racism. Excuse me, but I don't know of any laws in the U.S. that are like that at all, or have been for many years. I mean, it's just so strange to me that growing up, even though I disagreed a lot with the people that I grew up with, they got a lot of things right. For instance, in the 80s and 90s, we were playing with black kids. No one ever talked about it. It was just not, it was a non-issue. And these are all Trump supporters. Yeah, but those people are somehow racist bigots. But it was just never an issue. We just didn't talk about it. So if that was true, and we had essentially something like MLK's vision occurring, decades ago, I just don't see how any of that could be even remotely true. I used to say, that there's a kernel of truth to some of this, and because there has been, issues in the past, but these days, especially in the U.S., it's just patently false. It's just
so that's really interesting. So, we go around the world and read with Travis, and we ask people, we do spectrum street epistemology, and so we ask people a series of questions, and then they stand on, which is like a Likert scale, so they stand on these mats. It's a conspiracy without conspirators is a way to think about it. It's a conspiracy without conspirators. And so when we do this, we will ask questions like, is the United States racist? And people will go to the mats that says strongly agree. And then I will say, invariably, give me a single example of a law that's racist or systemic. And I mean, you don't believe me. You can go, we have literally hundreds of videos of me doing this with people all around the United States, college campuses, parks, no actors. I don't know any of these people. I have no idea who these people are. I've never seen them before. We don't sign up. There's no casting. There's nothing like that. Nobody has been able to give me a good answer, but yet they stand on the strongly agree for America is a racist nation, or there's systemic racism is a problem, or their laws are against black people, whatever. But nobody can give a response to that. Nobody can say why they believe it. And I think it's a great example of, again, I have to come back to this point because I think it's so important, and it speaks to what you were saying, like, how did we get into this mess? The answer is so obvious to me. I mean, it's just so obvious. We got into this mess because of academia. This is what's being taught to people. And they've literally fabricated entire lines of literature. I mean, they're just totally bogus. And we're teaching people this. So this is how they don't need faith. Travis mentioned he's born in a Christian household. It's a very hyper-Christian household. But these people don't have any faith. Well, why would they need faith? They have peer-reviewed journals that have been manufactured whole cloth. They're completely bogus.
But I remember I did social anthropology at university 24 years ago. And I remember reading Sherry Ortner and Marilyn Strathern and there's a anthropologist, but Foucault obviously, and Derrida and so on. And I remember thinking, well, this stuff is pretty hard to digest, honestly. And I remember thinking, it's never going to jump to the mainstream. And so the question, and I don't think it would have just on its own. And actually, it hasn't, because if you read Foucault, there are subtleties in Foucault that I think are lost in the way that his ideas have metastasized into the culture. My question is, what do you think has happened since the year 2000, when it was sort of dusty academics in ivory towers discussing this stuff in seminar rooms with 3 people and 10 more people who didn't show up? How has it gone from that to something that seems to be framing the entire global narrative? I mean, when you start hearing,
the answer is so clear and so obvious. Do you want to take it? Or want me to take it?
Yeah, well, I think just to piggyback off the first question to Peter, Pete's right about the institutions of academia pushing this, and they're certainly the main reason why people take it seriously. I don't think it's the main reason why it exists, because I think, as you and I had talked before, there are undercurrents, there are these other problems that lead people to go in this direction. So if those problems didn't exist, I don't think it could have taken off the way it did. There are obvious answers. I touched a little bit on the first episode, the proliferation of the smartphone and social media. And then there was this kind of perfect storm where Trump was elected, orange man bad, and then we have COVID. Everyone's locked in their house, getting, anxious, losing their jobs, starting to worry, and then, George Floyd happened. So it was this perfect trifecta, this storm. And that is, again, you can see this many years ago, as you said, it's in various types of literature. You can see a little bit of it online, but none of it really took off until that moment.
So I've been thinking about this a lot recently, that it seems to be we have these two sides in our politics, and you guys got an election coming up in a couple of weeks. And if you look at
we're going to do an event here on that.
Oh, yeah, we are. In fact, come here on the 6th, Melissa? Is it 6th of November? We're doing an election night and pizza event, so please come. So the question I was going to ask is, if you look at these two sides, the way I see it is that the Trump side look at the other side and they say they're the disease and we're the cure, but also vice versa. all the woke look at the Trump side and say, you're the disease and I'm the cure. I have to say, I look at both sides and I see them as symmetrical, if opposite, symptoms of a shared disease in need of a cure. They're more similar than they seem to suggest. So for instance, the Trump lot want to go back to a halcyon past, make America great again, and the woke lot want to go to a utopian future. America was never great. They both are discontented with the present. And if you look at the, it's very interesting, look at the transgender stuff, and then you look at the other side, the Peter Thiel's, the transhumanist stuff. They both seem to be really unhappy with the limits of the body. It doesn't matter if they're Peter Thiel, a billionaire, pretty right-wing, or these transgender people. The point I'm getting at is that the debate is a very partisan debate where everyone is thinking the problem's the other person's ideology. But are there deeper currents in the culture that we're all just symptoms of? And you know, the idea of divide and rule, as long as someone hates someone else more than the person causing the problem, then the person really causing the problem, you know, I'm British, so obviously in India we like to separate everyone and they didn't notice the British were governing. And in the same way, is there something more fundamentally amiss in the culture, which is leading to this very tense sort of culture war, which frankly, from my perspective, there's symmetrical patterns on both sides. I mean, for instance, the Trump side, there's a performative machismo. On the other side, there's performative fragility, like opposites. The Trump side, very figurative, loose use of language. The other side, a very literal use of language. You know, there's really interesting sort of symmetries. Do you see anything in that, or do you think it is strictly a woke issue, or do you think there's a broader cultural issue?
I mean, I think it's really complex. I don't think there's a simple answer. I do think, though, that the more I think about it, and the more I think about the trajectory of my own life of having grown up hyper-religious, where I'm not even allowed to listen to non-Christian music or watch movies that are not approved, or even spend time with my best friend who happened to not be a Christian, who was one of my only neighbors because I lived out in the middle of nowhere. It was very, my world was very sort of cordoned off from everything else. And so when I lost that, I went into disarray. I was depressed and suicidal, and it took a lot to get out of that. And I think, in a way, society is kind of going on that same trajectory. Whereas the difference is we have, obviously, multiple religions, but I think, especially for Western society, Christianity in particular is clearly on the decline. Not only in the U.S., but in Europe and elsewhere. And so I think that the past sort of angry atheist that I used to be, I would have cheered that on. But now I see that is just a massive problem. I don't know what the solution to that problem is, but I think that is one of the biggest issues that we face as a society. And I think, again, that comes to this point of lacking meaning because we don't have the structure that religion used to provide for people.
Yeah, I would, at the ripe old age of 58, I would answer that question differently now than I would have 6 months ago. And this is something I do from the moment I wake up to the moment I go to bed. I do it the work so that you don't have to. My answer before I would have agreed in principle with what was embedded in your claim. But now I see, and I think it's, Reed, and I've been reading some David Deutsch, etc. I think that the key out of this, the path out of this, there are a few paths out of this. So I'm going to segue for your question. So one of the things that I've learned in the last decade is that the only thing people want, or one of the few things people want more than to not be wrong, is to belong. So people want to be loved. They want communities. And if you can give them those communities, they'll make epistemic sacrifices, right? They'll sacrifice things within their knowledge landscape, or they'll at least profess to believe things. Daniel Dennett wrote about this in Breaking the Spell. They'll profess to believe things that they don't believe. I think one of the and this is the thing that I've been thinking a lot about in the last few months, is that we have to preserve the method of error correction. So one of the things, this may seem esoteric, but it's actually really not. We have to ensure that we have the ability to call out bad ideas. The Greeks had the word parrhesia, which is speaking truth in the face of danger. I don't mean it in that sense, somewhat. I mean it in a more institutionalized sense. So I always go back to the academy because I see that as the wellspring of problem. Hello, I'm at a great event. Peter Boghossian, Travis Brown. You should come. It's awesome. So I think that and when you don't have conversations with people across the divide, you damage the method of error correction. So we're almost throwing ourselves in a death spiral in which we are intentionally destroying the way to make it better. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Well, actually, it leads quite naturally into... Sorry, did you have something to add? No. Okay. Well, I was thinking that, if I think back to... I love watching the Oscars, right? And I remember, well, not so much now, but I used to... Actually, they're quite exciting in recent years, to be fair. But I remember back in the 90s, invariably, Jack Nicholson and Meryl Streep won all the Oscars, and Jack Nicholson would show up, and he'd just stand up with his dark glass and go, thanks. And he'd go and sit down. And he was cool, right? Jack Nicholson is cool, not just because his name is Nicholson, obviously a very cool name, but he was cool, right? And no one knows what Jack Nicholson believes. He was just kind of cool, and he was a good actor. Now, whenever any actor goes up and accepts their award, they tell you all the things they believe. They have to tell you all the messages. And it's interesting. I remember 20-odd years ago, when I was in school, I would have strong opinions on things, and people would say, basically, be cool. It's not cool to be so opinionated. And now it seems that you probably are not cool unless you're very hot. You're very animated with what you think. The fashion has shifted, and I'm wondering on this that it seems to me that, I put it to you, is not the problem less what people believe. It's just the intensity with which everyone believes what they believe.
That's preserving the method of error correction.
Well, this is kind of the idea, because you were saying about the idea of not speaking to others, that in a sense, engaging with someone else is not a narrational activity, it's a relational one. It's like an emotional engagement. Say, it's a Voltaire idea, I may not agree with you, but I defend your right to say something I think is stupid, And this idea that we still can be people. That seems to be lost, and I find that there's there's this kind of the intensity of belief across the spectrum right now. Well, how has that happened? Because it simply wasn't there 20-odd years ago. It was not there in the culture, and it's really, really prevalent now across at least Anglo culture now. Why are we all so intense about everything?
Well, so I could give you a brief genealogy of that, but I think, if I may, I think the more interesting question is, how do we get out of it? And so if I could summarize my life's work in a single question, so in the moral realm, the question would be, what kind of life ought I to lead? In the epistemic realm, in the realm of knowledge, it would be, how could I be wrong about that? Under what conditions would I be willing to change my mind? I think we need to organize our institutions, our academic institutions, around that question. I think that's the question we're not asking. Now, there are financial mechanisms. I have a friend who's a well-known actor, and he was telling me that and I know nothing about Hollywood, I'm just going on what he told me, unless you get up there, unless you signal constantly, you won't get the next part. Like, signaling is part of the business. It's built in at this point. So it's embedded in that, and again, the CEO of Netflix just came out and endorsed Harris, and then Netflix stock dropped. Because now we know, now it's at least conspicuous. But I think, again, the way that we get out of this cognitive and epistemological morass is just to ask ourselves that question, how could I be wrong about that? And it should never be unacceptable to ask people that question. Oh, so this person believes this. Oh, well, what would it take to change your mind about that? Like, that's what rational, civilized people do in civil society. But yet somehow it's turned from any kind of question these aren't epistemic questions, they're not questions of knowledge, they're questions of morality. So if I ask someone that, so why should we call people by their pronouns, like who don't align, if they don't align with their, like a natal male? The response should be, this is why. The response shouldn't be, well, fuck you, Nazi, right? The response shouldn't be throw eggs at their house, right? So there are ways that we proceed as civilized people in civil society. And among those methods that we have are, like, you do not disrupt the speaker. Like, so if someone doesn't like then you hold your own event, You don't accuse me of rape or misogyny or tell me I'm a Nazi. So that the rules of engagement have significantly changed.
Yeah, which I don't know if we're prepared to do any kind of Q&A, but if anyone disagrees, I'm certainly open to that.
They go first.
Yeah. But a couple things. You mentioned the intensity with which people believe things, and I'm not sure it's the intensity that's the problem. It's perhaps a lack of humility. Because interestingly, I put my mom and myself in the film I was making with Peter on how to have conversations across divides, because she's a very devout Christian woman, and I'm very much not. I'm also not a woman. But
what is a woman?
I'm not a biologist, sorry. No. And so what's interesting about that is I think she has the same, I love my parents, and I'm not saying anything negative about them. I think that she has the same level of intensity of belief that she had when I was growing up, but the way in which she conducts herself is very different. So she's willing to have a conversation, whereas in the past she wasn't willing. And so we kind of see the reverse of that now, I think. So it's not necessarily the intensity, it's more of like, how do you conduct yourself?
Yeah, so I've wondered about that. I don't know. I heard Peterson say something, either he said it or he said it to me, I can't remember, but when he would do these, he would answer only from things he knows, and then he made a change in his lectures. I made this change about 8 years ago, and I think my lectures have gotten better, but he thinks out loud on stage. So I'll just think out loud for a second about that question, because I've been thinking about that too. So in the United States, we have presidential elections, obviously, and we have debates. Now, usually there's one VP debate and multiple presidential debates, but the unspoken rule is whoever looks like they're going to win, they don't want many debates. And whoever's losing, they want a lot of debates, right? And you can see the reasoning in that, yes? Yes, okay. So I'm wondering if one of the reasons now that many Christians in general and many libertarians and conservatives, I'm wondering if one of the reasons that they're pushing for free speech and that they're pushing for open dialogue and discourse and communication is because they're getting slaughtered in the culture war. I wonder if that's the case. And if that were to flip, I wonder if they'd go back to their old tricks again. I'm just thinking out loud.
Any comments on that? Or?
Not on that specifically. I had a different comment on the error correction, which I do largely agree with Peter and read about this necessity for using reason to get ourselves out of these problems. But I do think that it's just important to note that, as I mentioned earlier, like many people are just not going to adopt that mentality. They're not going to ask these questions of themselves. They're not going to reflect deeply on some of these things. And so I think we do need to cultivate freedom of speech and freedom of the press and all of these things, and we need to keep those alive and intact, and that's crucial. But I think also allowing a kind of plurality where I don't have any problem if woke people believe what they believe, as long as they're not imposing that on me and the rest of society. So I don't need to eradicate those beliefs. I just don't want them to affect me, which is, you've talked about whether or not a person can hold a private belief. That's a question up for debate. But I think that sometimes and this was a problem with the atheist movement, they thought, we can just get rid of not only religion, but spirituality in general. Just get rid of it. It's totally superfluous. It's unnecessary. I used to think that way. I realize now that that's just wrong. You do need... The word spirituality is fraught with so many issues, but I think that society, people as individuals, do need some kind of spiritual sense to their lives, and so I think sometimes error correction is just not going to be a part of that calculus. I think it should be, but I guess my question to you is, do you really expect most people to adopt that framework of approaching the world?
No, I expect almost nobody to do so. And I expect people to radically overestimate their confidence in relation to the beliefs they hold. And I would say that's all the more reason that we need to encourage reason and rationality. But bracketing that for a second, given that we have blind spots and given that tribalism is strong and thinking about issues is in hard mode, deep fakes, disinformation, offices of weeding out disinformation, which are themselves organs of disinformation. Given that we have all of these things, it would seem that what we need is the thing that we don't have, and It's causing despair. And what we need strong institutions that, in a very real way, do our thinking for us. Now, I want to linger on this for a moment. So, in the United States now, distrust of institutions is at an all-time high. You can look at every single, I just read a Pew poll about this a while ago. The only thing Americans trust right now is their own individual physicians. Trust of medicine because of COVID is down, the trust of hospitals, trust of judicial systems, trust of academic. The whole thing is collapsing. The whole thing is collapsing. You cannot sustain a society in general and a democracy in particular if virtually nobody in the society thinks that's the case. So we need to create these strong institutions that have the methods of error correction embedded in them precisely because we know that we are fallible and subject to caprices and fads.
Okay. I just want to have one more question, and we can open up to questions from the audience. But this is an interesting point you raised, because I do feel we live in an era now of authors, not authorities. Everyone's an author of their own truth and so on. But I want to put a provocation to you both in this, though, because often when we talk about all this woke stuff, there's always this argument, and you made it in the film, that it's a Marxist thing or it's post-structural and so on. I've always felt it's a fundamentally neoliberal capitalist thing, and it may adopt the language and the theory, but it's used by the capitalist system. And I was thinking about this literally in the last couple of days about this, that the problem it seems that we have everywhere is this culture of the customer is always right. So in education, it's no longer you go to the professor and he's right, that the student's right. You go to the doctor and you're right. You go to everything. Everyone we're all the customer's right. Now I'm wondering, that impulse of, which is a very sort of neoliberal, very kind of American sales culture, of saying the customer's always right, that's how you sell more things. Is it not that's infected the culture? Because what we're really saying is that there are no authorities, you're right. But that's a great sales pitch. You're right, because you'll buy what I'm selling you. You do what is good for you. So my point is, are we suffering, neo-Marxism, or are we suffering hyper-capitalism?
Do you want?
Just real quick, it just made me think of AOC, the what's her name, Andrea Cortez. Yeah. So, yes, thank you. So she seemed to want.
She used to go by Sandy, but yeah.
She seemed to want to push for some kind of socialist vision while utilizing capitalism, right? Like tax the rich is on her dress, and she has a website where she's selling all these things. That doesn't necessarily mean that her ideology isn't in that direction of socialism. It just means that because she is happening to utilize a capitalistic means to spread her ideas, her ideas are still in that direction. So I don't know. I'm just trying to piggyback off of what you're saying, that this is a neoliberal sort of capitalist impulse. I'm not sure that it is, just because it happens to be flourishing now in the way in which we've structured free markets, et cetera. That doesn't necessarily mean that the ideas still aren't rooted in Marxism.
I think they're rooted, but my sense is that, like in the 80s, neoliberalism was saying we should all be entrepreneurs of our wealth, right? You should be maximizing your own wealth. And then by the 90s, we had you should be entrepreneurs of your health. So all the food fads emerged, and gym culture emerged, and running magazines. In the 1970s, I wasn't around then, but my father assures me, because he was an eccentric, that if he went for a run, everyone would say, "What are you running away from?" But by the 80s, it was exercise, right? And then now it seems we've shifted from being entrepreneurs of our wealth and our health to simply ourself. We're being taught to come up to be entrepreneurs of identity, to conglomerate grievances. It seems to me like a very sort of entrepreneurial mindset, which seems to be more capitalist than communist.
I don't think it's neoliberal at all. The simple answer to that, actually I don't want to give the simple answer, because I think that the more complicated answer is just way cooler, but it's more difficult. It's that those ideas spread that have more mimetic fitness. So you could think of this as a memeplex, as memes just dropping in and coming in, and certain memes will die out, and certain memes. In fact, I just had a conversation today with I can't remember his name. I remember his first name, a whale, somebody. I can't remember. What's his name, Reed? I can't remember.
Well, Taj Mahal?
Yeah. I just had a
beard, earring.
Yeah, beard, earring, cross. Yeah. Tattoos. And the mimetic fitness of it, like, I think Islam has an incredible mimetic traction right now. I think that there are certain ideas. I think you can look at the spread of this ideology not in terms of neoliberalism, but you've heard the words, I'm sure everybody's heard the words, lived experience. in my lived experience. So we live in an age in which we have the primacy of lived experience. Now, the really interesting question is, well, why is that? Again, I'm going to go with the Peterson thing. I'm just thinking out loud. This is hyper speculative and super esoteric, and then we can open it up. I think it could be an evolutionary adaptation to so many people living together in a society at the same time. So how does the gene, the selfish gene, how does the gene reproduce itself? It has to have an intellectual mimetic way of transmitting ideas to enable the genes to propagate. Societies are more mixed right now. They're mixed culturally, they're mixed biologically, they're mixed, I don't know if I like the idea of race, but they're mixed racially. So what do we do that help us to evolve and adapt to that so that we can push our genes forward? Well, we latch on to certain memes that have fitness, certain levels of fitness, and then those come within the suite of memeplexes. And so I think instead of thinking about it in terms of neoliberalism, I don't think that's a helpful heuristic in this case.
That's fine. No, okay, so I've certainly talked enough. So it'd be good to hear any audience questions. I think we're going to go a little bit longer because we started about 10 minutes late, but any questions? At the top, the gentleman up there in the white shirt. And put your hands up so I can see if you want me to pick you up.
Hello, my name is Harry Gibbs. I'm a student at Corvinus University. A lot of talk on spiritual and intellectual. To my mind, the woke exists very much in the physical sphere of street protest and what it does to people's lives on a physical level. If we look in England, recent riots were not necessarily to do with the woke, but certainly angles of it. So question, is there a current street protest group that you would endorse? And if there isn't, what would one look like if it was to be created by yourselves?
That's an awesome question. That's a money question. Travis, do you want to?
I mean, I'm not a fan of street protests, so I would neither engage in one or start one.
Yeah.
I mean, under most circumstances, there would be a caveat to that. But
Yeah, here are my street protests that I would endorse. Formulate your beliefs on the basis of evidence. I'd be leading that street protest. I'd have the big flag with an E on it. Change your mind. Be willing to change your mind, or be willing to revise your beliefs in a more formal sense. This is another street protest which I'd had the banner, preserve the method of error correction. I'd be out there marching proudly. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Janet.
I'd like to Hello.
Yeah, it's working.
Hello.
It's good.
It is on?
Yeah.
It's on. First of all, can I respond to that?
This is a free country.
Janet Karakash. I'm thinking of Nazi Germany, and what you said, I'm sorry, it doesn't fly. It's like you put up your poster and exactly who you're going to change or convince. It doesn't feel convincing to me what you're saying. You, Trevor...
Could you, before you go into it, can
Yes,
I respond to that before you go into it? The question, and if I have his question correctly, it was, is there a current protest in which you endorse? No. But is there one in which you would endorse and be part of? That doesn't mean it's going to change anyone's mind. I just answered the question directly.
All right, okay. Trevor, you did make a reference to structure. Travis, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
At some point. But I would stress it. I'm thinking of all the people who came back and survived the Holocaust, or the labor battalions in Hungary, certainly. I'm going to use the word key. It may be a little too strong, but my sense is what was key to them going on with their lives was the structure, going back to the structure that life had for them. The jobs, the music, going to weekly concerts, going up to the, as my father-in-law would have said, going out to the green every Sunday. And that's what enabled them to go on. In the case of this particular gentleman, he was not religious, absolutely not religious, had already converted in the 1930s to keep his job. I think the systematic dismantling of everything, whether you call it institutional, whether you call it structure, whether you call it religious, has left, and then insert the academia, has left young people absolutely without a chance. And all they've got now is this really raw belief. And my sense is that this belief, to repair the job, to make a repair job, to do something to correct this, this is like the Inquisition. There is nothing but the belief, and I feel that people who are looking for ways around it you're not going to find them. It's as intractable as anything in the Inquisition, I feel. And so, I scratch my head as how do we get out of this? Because there is no dialogue, there is no discussion, there is no, if I ask you, do you think maybe you might be wrong, or would you like to reconsider this? It's an absolute brick wall.
Yeah, no, that's a valid concern, and I feel that way often. It gets depressing. I think some of what Peter and Reed and I are doing, and Aaron, is important because people actually do watch some of these videos, and we actually, I'm blanking on her name, bald black woman.
Oh, Africa Brooke.
Africa Brooke, yeah. So Africa used to actually describe herself as very woke, and she saw some of Peter's videos and saw herself in the people responding in this kind of deranged manner. So you do see that, even with just videos. And something that I try to do with my films is not just ask people to reflect deeply on their beliefs, but to have a narrative structure in the film that is emotionally engaging. Because without the emotional engagement, you won't reach very many people. So I think telling better stories is one potential way to help get people at a kind of emotional or visceral level. Again, there's no panacea, there's no perfect solution for this problem, but that's the way that I can do it because I'm a storyteller and I like making films. But in terms of the stuff that Pete does or other people, everyone has their own approach.
Just want to add, so there was reason for optimism. People change their minds all the time. I mean, there's even a word for it, apostasy, right? So people change. Yeah, people change their minds under extraordinary circumstances. So the phenomenon exists, and the work that we try to do, we have a small nonprofit, is we're trying to help people to think more deeply about these things. And as Travis said, if someone wants to be woke or they want to believe in whatever, I don't really care I honestly don't care what people believe. I genuinely can say that. I want people to have the cognitive liberty to believe in what they want to believe. I don't want to be coerced into a particular belief. And so there are kind of bedrock principles, and I'm hoping that Reed, Travis, Aaron, and I are moving the needle on that.
So I guess it's not so much you want to police their speech, but you just want to live in a society where no one is policing anyone's speech. In this sense.
I don't know if that would be the framing. I think that the two words are cognitive liberty. Like that's what we have to value, and all of the propositions and conclusions that come with it. I believe in freedom of assembly. I believe in freedom of press. I believe in Miranda rights.
So could you say defund the thought police?
Well, that's if you look at. I hate making these things political, but if you do look at the Twitter bios or the X bios of Harris and Trump, one of those people has their pronouns in the bios.
Okay, I'll go. Okay, so at the back, please.
Hello, my name is Spencer Silby. I work in DC as a consultant, and I formerly worked at the Heritage Foundation. And a figure I saw several times in the video sort of appealed to as perhaps the authority we would like to return to is Martin Luther King, Jr. And I wonder if that's a steady foundation given sort of the ever-increasing nature of progressivism. And do you see sort of the current manifestation of perhaps the civil rights movement and those who were once contemporaries of Martin Luther King Jr. now marching hand in hand with the most radical? Do you see the current movement as a natural outcropping of the civil rights movement, or perhaps the original goal of it?
So would Martin Luther King Jr. be cancelled today, I suppose?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. A lot of woke people, for the lack of a better term, do latch on to certain things that he said, like in the Birmingham jail and these various little tidbits. And then, of course, you do have more progressives who marched with him, and he had people of all different stripes. But I think it's less about one person, more about the fundamental truth that he outlined, which is that we shouldn't care about race or sex in terms of how we get along with people and what's important. I would say, again, to answer your question, it's similar to what we were talking about. Why did Portland become one of these sort of epicenters? Because they were fighting for supposedly equal rights, for women and for gays and all this stuff, and then comes along this woke movement, and all of a sudden they're on the same trajectory. It's obviously a lot of the same people. A lot of people took down the gay pride flag and put up the trans flag, because they think it's the same thing. So I think that these people who push for these things often do, unfortunately, tend to just sort of go with the wind, so to speak. So it's unfortunate, but I don't know quite what the solution to that is, other than sticking to some of those fundamental principles that have nothing to do with whether or not trans children exist or this sort of thing.
Yeah, I'd just like to make a recommendation. The Australian filmmaker Mike Nayna, Nayna, has some fantastic stuff on that. Basically, that this dominant moral orthodoxy now piggybacks off tries to piggyback off the civil rights movement, but it's not. It's just not true. In fact, if anything, it's the opposite of the civil rights movement. And again, I'll let you watch Mike's stuff.
Thanks. At the top corner. Thank you.
Hey, this was really, I enjoyed this. I'm Phil, a former American diplomat in this town, now retired. Travis, I grew up in a home a little bit like yours probably, but I probably just adjusted my religion a little bit. I didn't throw it away. And that's kind of what I wanted to ask you guys about. When I go to Borders in the United States or bookstore, I see all this tarot card stuff and spells and witchery and everything. And I just don't think people are going to get super rational, Peter. I mean, people want an enchanted world. They want to believe in something. It might look a little religious, or this looks religious.
And you got to be more optimistic.
And I don't know.
I
don't think we're going away from religion per se. I'm not even sure that the decline of Christianity is inevitable. It's going to change. But could you guys play with that a little bit, that idea? Rational, yes, but people want enchantment, people want faith.
Can I actually just add something in there? We were talking earlier about, I said, what are the points of disagreement between the two of you? And you were saying about Peter's fixation on the goal is rationality. And I suppose it's an interesting question of to what extent should our lives be understood in purely rational terms. I mean, I speak for myself, all the things that mean something to me are completely irrational. Like love is quite a big thing for most of us, usually very irrational. We all make bad choices. So
I don't think that's true.
You think that's rational?
So we went out for, I'm not giving away any confidences, but we went out to dinner the other night. If every time we went out to dinner, I'm not going to name names because you're not here, but if your girlfriend, just insulted you the whole evening and then threw water in your face, I don't know, maybe that would call into question, like her behavior, she behaves a certain way toward you, and you can make reasonable inferences that she cares about you, right?
It's a hypothetical case, but maybe.
No, it's a very hypothetical. No, that did not
actually happen.
I'm just giving you an example.
Although I
be really clear if anyone's watching.
I don't know if this is the point you're making, but a lot of that is not conscious. It's not a conscious decision that he's making every night where he goes out and is treated well by his girlfriend. I think a lot of that, if you take a broader perspective, it's rational in the context of evolutionary psychology and how you're going to behave and how to find connection, etc. But it's not rational in the sense of I'm thinking through this problem right now and this is how I'm approaching my life. Because people don't do that. One interesting thing to touch on is, you said Christianity may just change, and it has. I mean, you can see a huge percentage of both Catholic and Protestant churches have adopted wokeness. You see drag queens up, on the front, preaching at the pulpit, or with children, and you see, I showed some clips of George Floyd at churches. Actually, in Portland, I was trying to find a place to film with my mom and myself. And there was this basically like a shrine to George Floyd in this Catholic church. So even these institutions are not immune from the creep of this other ideology. I don't think that religion will ever go away. I do think that as Pete alluded to, we should try to be more and more reasonable and rational. I agree with you, though, that most people they want a very, trying to think of the best way to phrase it. I mean, they do want a story for their lives that gives their life purpose, and for some people that will be traditionally religious, for some people it won't be. I think all we can really do is prompt people to have better means of finding what that is, and then with the key caveat of not imposing on other people, except for perhaps their own family or however you want to deal with that. But in terms of legally and how we interact as a society, having that humility, again, regardless of how intensely a person believes the story that they believe, but not saying you have to believe it too, or you're going to burn in hell, or you're a bigot, whatever the version is.
Can I actually ask you about rationality? I mean, a lot of the woke stuff actually has a strange rationality to it, in the sense that it's quite sort of, people often, in their literal understanding of language, I mean, like, so much about language is about intent and context, right? And a lot of comedians get, cancelled or thrown off Netflix or something because people have taken their joke literally. Now that's a kind of quite almost autistically rationalistic approach to something. And I think that there's not a lot in the culture, and this is kind of my point I was trying to make, that all the things that actually are the essence of life are actually not things we can explain in a matrix of language.
Okay, so in philosophy there's a thing called coherence theory of truth. There's a coherence, that is, propositions cohere in some kind of a matrix, they're linked together, or there's foundationalism, which is it's kind of like an architectonic structure with, Descartes, I think, therefore I am, and then you build up to, you can trust your senses, I know the world. This is in Descartes' meditation. So I wouldn't say the word is rational, but the propositions within critical social justice or wokeism cohere together. They cohere in a framework that's completely delusional and untethered to the world, but they cohere. But that doesn't make them rational.
Just to pivot on, I mean, false faith with the woke sort of Puritan mindset. What do you have faith in?
Nothing. My life is completely, totally, and utterly devoid of faith.
So you have faith in fate?
No, I have literally no faith.
Really?
Zero.
But don't you have? There's some sort of
nothing.
Faith. Really, nothing.
I am joyfully devoid of faith.
And you literally left your faith. So what do you? But you said you've drawn strength from. In the film, it's very interesting. You said you've drawn strength and the meaning from obligations to others, keeping busy, and so on. That would seem to be the pattern. What's your faith?
Yeah, I'm not sure if faith plays a role there. I mean, it depends on, you can equivocate about the term faith. I mean,
I don't mean it theologically, but what do you trust in?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's a radically different question. May I
please.
Just for a moment? So think about this. So think about you're on a holiday in some like creepy, weird place in the middle of freaking nowhere, right? And you have a guide. And there's a bridge in front of you, and the bridge is this old rickety bridge, and you say to the guide, I don't know, man. I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure that can take all of our weight. Can it take all of our weight? And the guide says, I trust that can take your weight. Same scenario. Now the guide says, I have confidence that that can take all of your weight. Same scenario. Now the guide says, I have faith that can take all of your weight. Got to disambiguate.
I think they're quite similar.
We got to disambiguate. You think they're quite similar?
I think so, yeah.
Really? Okay, well, think about this as an example. Can we linger on this or no?
I mean, they all leave me with some anxiety, but yeah.
Okay, well, all right. I can give you another example. I mean, it's similar.
I have a good example if you want one.
Go ahead.
I was out on a lake with one of my best friends, Adam, and it was in the middle of the night because we wanted to see the stars. I didn't know until later that he was on mushrooms. I don't think I knew that. But it was a single-person kayak, and it was just him and I, and it's a freezing cold lake. It's called Clear Lake in Oregon, and it's extremely deep. So it's fairly dangerous. There's no light. There's nothing. And at one point, we were talking about this and kind of how a little bit sketchy this was, and he turned to me and said something to the effect of, that's when you really have to have faith in the universe. And I thought, no, I trust that you and I are going to not die by doing the appropriate things to not fall off of this. I don't trust the universe at all.
There was another question up here, the gentleman with the laptop.
Oh, hi, thank you. So I'm actually a sociology professor at Corvinus University, and I do teach critical race theory, post-colonialism, about a lot of
come to the right place.
Inequalities. So right, and so maybe I'm part of the part of the problem. But I really enjoyed the talk. It's very refreshing. I haven't been to an event like this, so I'd love to talk to everyone here more. But I actually have a project, something very interesting related to how people interact with minorities in society. And I have also, being a professor of sociology, sat through a very progressive university in a lot of classes with very left-wing, social justice-oriented professors. And one thing I often feel is missing is that there are some students who are uncomfortable with certain types of differences, people they are unfamiliar with. For example, transgender people, mixed race people, maybe some very orthodox people, and whether they be Jews or Muslims. And I often sense, particularly from a lot of immigrant students who come from more conservative cultures, but also maybe some that don't have so much exposure, they didn't grow up in a very multicultural urban environment like I did, that they are uncomfortable with these things. And I think one of the problems emerges that they don't have an opportunity to express the fact that they're uncomfortable with this stuff, often because they never encountered it. And I'm very fascinated that, like a lot of professors, the assumption is like, you're wrong, these people should be treated equally, you shouldn't feel uncomfortable around them, you shouldn't discriminate against them, and rather than acknowledging their discomfort, because when you just say, you dismiss it, then you kind of invalidate it. And when people feel invalidated, they feel like you're ignoring their feelings. They're real, I'm uncomfortable walking through the Tenderloin with these drug addicts or homeless people and so on. And so I'm very interested, for anybody here, if you want to do an interview or talk with me about this, how you've seen this work in the classroom where there's maybe teachers who are better able to deal with that discomfort, with difference, with things people aren't familiar with, and students as well, how they deal with that in a productive way. Because the reality is, I feel a lot of the time, if these kind of feelings of discomfort aren't addressed, then that can easily come to a feeling of resentment, which can lead to maybe eventually hate, even violence against people different, because just people are uncomfortable and they're not able to have their feelings about that validated and acknowledged.
Well, first, let me say most sincerely and profoundly, thank you for coming. And I genuinely mean that. I find that one of the problems that we face now is that we're so divided in our echo chambers that we don't have an opportunity to speak to people with whom we have substantive differences. So I'm genuinely grateful that you came, so thank you very much. So as an educator, as a lifelong educator, my response, I published a piece on this, I can't remember the name of the journal, but it was about without going too far into the weeds, a pedagogical method about the title of the paper, I think, was From People to Propositions. And I talked about how using certain dialectical tools in the classroom, like the Socratic method, moves the conversation from immutable characteristics of people to the truth claims embedded within those propositions. So that would be one way to think about it. But the other way to think about it is the condition you described is, this is why I love being 58. It's awesome. You can just it really does give you a temporal perspective on things that you don't get when you're in your 30s or 40s. But when I was way back when, you sons and daughters, when I was in college, those issues, they either weren't as conspicuous or they were masked by a certain pedagogical method. So I think even the very idea that people are uncomfortable, it's piggybacking off of what Travis said. I mean, I had all different kinds of friends when I was a kid, different religions, different races. It was just a non-issue. But it's become an issue because we've intentionally raised the consciousness of people. And people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, and people like Robin DiAngelo, and people like Ibram X. Kendi, they've placed something in our consciousness which is inherently divisive. And I think that there are ways to get out of that problem, not adjudicate those problems, but I think that there are ways as educators we can get out of those. The answer is longer, but I'm more than happy to talk to you about this afterward, because I think that that is, we don't need to resort to a tool that teaches us that we need to identify people on the basis of differences in intersectionality. We have to go, to use a word that Dr. Nicholson used, supraordinate identities. We need to go and find things that bind us in terms of our commonalities.
Can I actually just say something on this? I remember seeing a tweet about 4 years ago, and someone said, during all these things in Portland, and there's a great tweet, this guy said, if you'd asked me, it was just a straight white guy, right, talking, and he said, if you'd asked me 10 years ago to list 10 words to describe myself, white and straight would not have been among them, and now they would be, and I don't think that's progress. And it's interesting, because I remember 20 years ago, when I was at university, it was quite diverse. And I think the solution was it was Martin Luther King's idea. You recognize someone's character, nothing more superficial, the race or the gender. And quite frankly, I think when you first meet someone, the first minute you see them, you're like, oh, they're from Kenya, or they're from somewhere, or they're Hungarian, or they're English, or something. After a couple of minutes, all you really care about is whether they're interesting or a decent person.
Yeah, that's why one of the first things you said, and I was like, it just struck me as like, I don't think we should treat people equally at all. I mean, there's some people who just have really idiotic ideas. So, like, why would I give those countenance? Or they're just some people who are just not nice people. They're just jerks. So why? For me, I just disengage. Yeah. But by the way, just parenthetically, that's not a reason to be mean to them. Plato talks about this in the Republic. When you beat a horse, you don't make it a better horse, right? So the way is almost always with some kind of civility and decency, but that doesn't mean you have to engage, and it also doesn't mean you have to treat people equally.
Over here, please. Oh, and then here too. There and there. Can we take both questions? This question and the other question. Thank you.
My name is Esther Kovács. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Vienna, and sorry for my accent. Apparently, I'm the first person speaking here with having another mother tongue than English. And my question relates to that is the context, because I had the feeling we had a very insightful film and analysis about the US debates and US discourses. I can go with much of what you have said in your analysis, partly also about the origins, but definitely why this is worrying. Why is this relevant here? That's my question.
Awesome question.
Because I believe it's not irrelevant. So I don't want to, it's not a provocative question. It's genuinely meant. The context is different. I think US is important also just because it's good to know what is happening in the US, but also because of the cultural hegemony, diffusion of ideas, whatever. But how would you make up your mind, or what would you tell us?
We're both chomping at the bit to get at that question. Go ahead, Travis.
Did you want to take both questions, or should we just...
The other question first, and then we'll have to wrap up after that.
So I'm not either an English-speaking native, but I will try to ask my question. So congratulations to Travis for his thorough philosophical analysis of wokeism, and also for your recovery from your back ache, and also the technical aspect of your films. I acknowledge that there are some common points in my own journey, because I'm a dogmatic theologian, so I'm trained to discern between an orthodox thinking and a heresy, and I like it a lot. So when you said that wokeism was in some institutions and you were able to identify woke thinking in the society, I felt myself concerned. And also because I used to be very religious, and now I'm less, even if I still have faith. So I have just two questions. Maybe they are a bit provocative, but it's the spirit of the debate, and with respect and even more. I had the impression that you were denouncing in wokeism the excesses of your own education, meaning that you describe wokeism as a kind of hyper-religious movement, and this is and you suffered from this, so you were transferring a little bit some maybe this is a question. And the other one is sometimes I myself know the risk of being too dogmatic, meaning that I would establish myself as the magisterium, and I would deem and I would judge this is good, this is bad thinking, and the risk is to build a new religion with me as the magisterium, and isn't it the risk also in your own case? Thank you.
Great questions. Well, to answer the first question, then maybe Pete can respond. Well, what I think is interesting is we went to Taiwan earlier this year, and around that time I was making a documentary on the transgender topic, and I met my girlfriend Ellen there, and we talked about how...
They're in love.
She's wonderful. We talked about how they were trying to pass certain legislation without anyone knowing about, like changing the sex marker on the IDs, for instance. And she's lived there most of her life, and she had no idea that that was happening. So I think what happens in the U.S. proliferates outward. I mean, I hope that Hungary is more immune, but a lot of this stuff is surreptitious. People try to do this without anyone else knowing, or they include it under other banners. For instance, in Oregon, where I used to live, there was a law that they were trying to pass. It was actually a sort of a multi-stage law where they were trying to give, abortion rights for women. But within that law, somehow, I don't even know how they connected this, was they wanted 15-year-olds to be able to cut off their breasts without their parents' consent. So they snuck in this other totally insane aspect of social life with this, what most people in Oregon would consider supporting. So I think that's one thing to just be aware of, that often this stuff is sort of creeping around in the background. But I don't know if you have a different response.
No, those questions for the film, and I'll take your question. So I think that your question is really, really good. It's a great audience. So this gives me no joy to say this. Like I get no joy in telling you what I'm about to tell you. The fact that I would sit here and tell you that my country is in many ways turned into the bad guy for stuff that we are exporting gives me no joy. We should be exporting, in my opinion, if we export anything, democracy, freedom, universal human rights, etc. But we're not. And our main cultural export now, and it's embedded in our films and our music and all of our institutions, our media institutions. There's a great book, Snakes in the Ganga, in which Rajiv Malhotra writes about, it's a massive book, it's huge. I wrote the foreword to the book, it's just truly massive. It is an unbelievably well-documented book about how wokeism has infused the Indian institutions. This is what we are exporting. And when we go around the world, yes, it for sure is more pronounced in the Anglosphere. And the reason for that is because wokeism is, like the authors, etc., it comes from the Anglosphere. It is my hope, like Travis, and that's one of the reasons that I'm in Hungary. And so when I told you, to give that talk to hundreds of high school kids recently, and I was telling them, you're fine just the way you are. Like, you're fine. If you're gay, you're fine. I have two kids, they're both gay. If you're gay, you're fine. You don't need to chop off your genitals. You don't need to have your breasts removed. You don't need to take hormone blockers. You're fine. You're fine. There's nothing wrong with you. And we know and you should watch Travis' other films, genuinely excellent. It's much darker than this, but it's genuinely excellent. We know, Andrew Doyle talks about this, Helen Joyce, who Travis interviewed for the film, we know that the vast majority of those kids, 80%, are either gay or they have autism or those comorbidities, and those numbers are even higher. And so the fact that I, as an American, would be standing here explicitly repudiating the main ideological doctrines that the United States is exporting, I mean, that's a disgrace. Let's not mince words about it. It's a disgrace. I'd much rather be talking to you about, I don't know, Socrates or something. I don't know, but that's why it matters, and that's why it's important, and that's why you need to protect your institutions from this mind virus.
We should wrap it up pretty quickly, though.
I think it's closer to 60% turn out to be gay, but it's like 88% of them, if they're left alone, these kids, they will desist.
Isn't it? So I thought it was. Is it 80% autistic? So what's the 60 and 80? Like, did I mix those numbers up?
Well, I think it's between 85 and 88. I forget, but it's very high number. Close to 90% will desist, and I think it's closer to 60, 65% that end up being gay. But then just to try to answer your questions, they were great questions. Yeah, I mean, that's sort of why I brought up this idea that it's okay to be intense about what you believe, but you have to have humility. Because it's something I've thought a lot about. Like, okay, there's this problem of meaning making, right? There's this problem of purpose in life. So am I going to come up with a solution? No. All I can really do is point to other people like, Viktor Frankl and others who have thought about this deeply, Nietzsche being another person, and say, this is what they're sort of roughly outlining. But again, it's as I said in the film, making sweeping statements about these problems is in itself kind of an issue, because again, I don't want to force my approach to the world onto everyone else. I do think it's pretty good because I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, but I certainly could be wrong in many areas. So I don't want to create another religion, that's for sure. And I'm trying to remember what the other question was. What I grew up with and how I was claiming that I saw similarities in wokeness. Yeah, to be clear, I don't think most Christians behave like this. It's just what I happened to grow up with was they were very strict, very stringent, and the similarities were more in the sense of, as I alluded to earlier, if you disagree with us, you're going to burn forever. And now it's if you disagree with us, you're a bigot. So it's just stepping out of line, which is actually a little bit better. You're a bigot, you're not going to burn forever, but you still are ostracized from society, right? It's still a problem. So it's actually kind of an improvement in a way. But again, I don't think most Christians are like that. They're not. I know plenty of great Christians, but yeah, those were the similarities that I was saying. If I happen to have a theological question, the particular family that I grew up in and the community I grew up in did not encourage questions. They discouraged questions. Same thing living in Portland, Oregon. You ask a question about, well, how do you know a child is actually trans? No, you're evil. You're a bigot. Shut up. So those were the similarities.
Thanks, Travis. We're going to have to wrap it up now. Melissa, you want to make a comment?
A quick announcement, if I may.
Okay, and I'll thank the guys out. Go ahead.
Please. Yeah. On Monday, the 28th, from 10 to 11:30 in the gallery, just around the corner. That's a.m. We're going to have a member of parliament from South Korea, the Korean Republic, and that's Ms. Na Kwang-won. And she's going to talk about demographics, the big demographic crisis that Korea is facing with the lowest birth rate in the world. So please come. And then November 6th, from 6 to 8 in this room, is our post-election analysis with the decision desk staffed by our great interns.
Thanks, Melissa. Okay, and Travis, you wanted to say one last thing, actually.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one last thing, which is if you'd like to watch more of the series, you can see it on YouTube. It's at Become the Signal, I believe, or the Signal Productions. I'm actually blanking on that. But if you look up the Signal Productions, you'll find it on YouTube. And the link at the end of each video where it said the Woke Reformation.locals.com is an old link. So if you want to support it, it's just travisbrown.locals.com. And there are 11 episodes in the series. We talk about a wide range of things. Vivek Ramaswamy is in it. Peter's in it a lot more than that. Douglas is in it some more, and Niall Ferguson and many other people. So.
Yeah, and I just want to say thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you if you have differences of opinion, ideological differences. This is exactly what we need. I'd like to thank Melissa. I'd like to thank the Danube Institute. I'd like to thank MCC for inviting me over here. And I'd like to thank everybody for coming. And Travis, for your great work. And Dr. Nicholson, thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
Our pleasure. And I'd like to thank the two guys for being here. Thanks so much, guys. It's been a good evening.
Thank you.